Welcome to Infinite Business Dynamics. Okay, today we're unlocking a concept that honestly trips up a lot of people, but it's absolutely crucial. It's basically a secret weapon for your project management arsenal. We're talking about mastering agile procurement. So, whether you're gearing up to dominate the PMP exam or you just want to run smoother, better projects in the real world, you are exactly where you need to be. We're going to break down exactly how flipping your whole approach to contracts literally changes the entire game.
So let's dive right into a foundational idea straight from the Agile Manifesto: customer collaboration over contract negotiation. For decades, project management was treated like this adversarial boundary battle. The contract was basically a giant brick wall between the vendor and the client. But the modern approach, it requires completely tearing down that wall. We're going to see how shifting your mindset from fighting over terms to actually co-creating as partners with your customer maximizes real-world value. And spoiler alert, it's an absolute must for passing those tricky situational exam questions.
All right, let's step back in time a bit for part 1, Origins and Core Philosophy. We'll look at historical procurement failures and the structural shift toward trust-based agile systems.
Think back to the late 1990s. Software projects were totally dominated by these massive, rigid, fixed-price contracts. Organizations were operating under the seriously flawed assumption that they could just freeze all the variables right up front. But what did that do? It created a brutal us versus them haggling mentality. Instead of building actual value, clients and vendors just sat around arguing over frozen parameters. It was a waterfall bottleneck, and it led to widespread cost overruns and massive delays. I mean, it was so bad, it was even getting called out in formal Government Accountability Office or GAO audits. As the Agile Practice Guide points out, a ton of project failures stem directly from these relationship breakdowns, where negotiations just created winners and losers. And that whole mess? That's exactly why we had to have a strategic paradigm shift. Traditionally, scope was locked away up front in this giant spec document, but in the Agile approach, we keep a high-level baseline and just let the details emerge organically over time. Plus, where traditional change management was slow and honestly pretty discouraged, Agile fuels it with continuous feedback. The whole relationship dynamic fundamentally shifts. We move completely away from that slow, win-lose adversarial boundary and jump into a dynamic, shared risk model that's all about win-win value. Moving on to part 2, PMP ECO exam mapping. Let's analyze exactly how the 2026 PMP exam content outline aligns this collaboration-first mindset directly to the people and process domains. Starting off with the people domain, specifically stakeholder engagement, there are 3 absolutely critical tasks we need to zero in on. Task 4 demands that you engage stakeholders by building immediate trust and establishing a solid baseline of psychological safety. Task 5 is all about continuous value alignment, making sure your project outputs actually match real-world business values during every single iteration cycle. And then there's Task 6, which holds a massive secret for exam takers. The customer is not just an external client who pays the bills. The customer absolutely includes your internal sponsors, department heads, and end users alike. Don't forget that. Now, let's map this over to the process domain. Looking at Task 5, procurement. You really need to recognize that traditional rigid change freezes, those are a massive exam trap. When it comes to agreement planning, modern Agile PMs have to plan and manage flexible procurement routes. The ECO requires you to choose contracting models that actually allow for collaborative pivots. And as for negotiation strategy, negotiating doesn't mean digging your heels in to protect a static contract. Actually, scratch that, it's the opposite. Your strategy should steer agreements toward shared, flexible outcomes where both parties can actually benefit from lessons learned along the way. Ready for some practical tools? Here is part 3, Agile Contracting Toolkit. We're getting into specific frameworks and strategies that protect companies legally while keeping that continuous collaboration totally alive. Let's break down the brilliant mechanics of 3 specific adaptive contract strategies. First up, multi-tier agreements. Here, you lock down all the stable legal stuff, like intellectual property and liabilities, inside a master services agreement, but you leave the scope configurable in shorter iteration statements of work. Next, we have value-based packages. So instead of slapping on one giant price tag, you structure agreements around much smaller, fixed-price deliverables. This allows for continuous re-estimation. And finally, my favorite, the changes for free clause. This is a huge stress reliever. It allows a client to cancel unneeded scope early or easily swap out active backlog items of equal cost with 0 penalty. It completely eliminates that adversarial fight over change requests. And that brings us to the DSDM inverted triangle. DSDM stands for Dynamic Systems Development Method, and this concept completely flips the traditional waterfall model on its head. In those traditional models, you lock in the scope and you just let time or cost slip. But the DSDL model, it locks in time, cost, and high-quality standards at 100% right up front. The scope is what becomes your flexible, adjustable variable. You prioritize backlog items right alongside the customer, sprint by sprint. It's a real game changer because it transforms those tense legal battles into a joint prioritization process, ultimately protecting your bottom line timeline.
All right, let's bring it all together for Part 4, Exam Trap and Prep Mastery. We are going to identify standard situational exam traps and PMI-aligned scenarios so you can defeat them.
When applying these concepts on the test, there are 3 deadly exam sins you have to avoid. Trap number 1, believing the contract is sacred. On situational questions, never, ever side with rigid contract compliance over actual value. The winning choice almost always involves renegotiating or adapting the terms. Trap number 2, assuming customer only means external. Remember, the PMP defines both external and internal stakeholders as customers. And trap 3, denying Agile scope pivots. If you see an option that says no changes allowed during an Agile or hybrid scenario, huge red flag, it's a trap. Change should always be processed via collaborative backlog prioritizing.
Let's walk through a sample conflict scenario to see this in action. Say a vendor claims the signed contract completely forbids mid-project changes, but the customer states the product doesn't meet evolving marketplace needs. So how should the project manager proceed? Well, the correct choice is to facilitate a cooperative meeting to align the scope and adjust the agreement terms. The core reason here is that the PM must act as a bridge. Forcing strict contract limits destroys trust and basically guarantees the product is going to fail in the real world. You always have to prioritize collaborative workshops and shared risk models. So to wrap up this explainer, collaborative stakeholder frameworks build high trust, they drastically reduce costly rework, and most importantly, they protect real business values.
Version 2.
Here's a quick roadmap for today's explainer. 1. Systemic waterfall failures. 2. The Agile paradigm shift. 3. Agile contracting formulas. 4. Industry R&D and procurement. And 5. Mastering exam situations.
Section 1. Systemic waterfall failures. Uncovering the shared pain.
Before we can fix this system, we really have to understand why traditional contracting leaves vendors and clients practically pulling their hair out. Back in the late 90s, the software industry basically copy-pasted procurement models from physical engineering and construction. Think about building a bridge, right? You absolutely need exhaustive requirements up front. So teams froze their statements of work, their SOWs, before development even started. But building new products isn't like building a bridge. Technical realities surface, markets shift, and freezing those requirements so early just resulted in immense, unavoidable waste. And that leads to the exact adversarial traps of these systemic waterfall failures. You end up with massive information asymmetry, forcing clients to lock in specs when they actually know the least about what's technically feasible. It becomes the zero-sum game where every single scope change is an administrative battleground. Ultimately, development teams start hiding behind defensive postures to avoid rework, and clients stuff the SOWs early out of pure fear they'll never get future upgrades. Nobody wins. Section 2. The Agile paradigm shift. Contracts as collaboration facilitators. So, recognizing the gridlock is step 1. Step 2 is a complete mindset shift. In a traditional approach, you've got this formal, rigid change control board, the CCB, demanding massive impact audits for every little tweak. But in the Agile paradigm, this transforms into collaborative backlog grooming. You're dynamically refining requirements, trading features without administrative penalties, and keeping the focus on win-win partnerships instead of just checking off compliance milestones. Building on that, our risk allocation fundamentally changes too. Instead of a one-sided risk transfer that just breeds bad vendor-buyer dynamics, risk is balanced and shared across short, empirical sprint cadences. And because of this, your administrative overhead drops dramatically. Your focus stays purely on direct communication and working deliverables, rather than wasting time on change orders and legal audits. The really crucial point here is that by lowering those administrative barriers, you create a high-trust environment. And trust unlocks incredible value drivers. You gain the ability to dynamically pivot when the market changes. You minimize waste by actually empowering clients to cancel low-value sprints early, saving their remaining budget. It creates psychological safety, evolving the whole relationship into a collaborative co-creation space.
Section 3. Agile contracting formulas. Real-world mechanics. Now I hear you. We're thinking, sounds awesome in theory, but how do we actually write this into a contract? We need operational frameworks that balance financial safety with flexibility. Enter Jeff Sutherland's Agile formulas, designed precisely to align this risk sharing. We're talking about two primary concepts: changes for free and money for nothing. These aren't just catchy buzzwords, they're literal contractual clauses that mathematically secure the seller's profit while maximizing the buyer's ROI.
Let's define the first one. Changes for free is an agile contract mechanism that protects vendor margins while giving the client incredible flexibility. Say a client discovers a critical new business need mid-project. They don't file a costly change order. They simply swap an unstarted feature from the backlog for the new requirement, as long as it's of equal size and effort. The original budget and timeline boundaries remain perfectly intact. Brilliant, right?
We can also use alternative agile contracts if the situation calls for it, like a graduated fixed price structure, which shares schedule variance risk by tweaking hourly rates based on delivery performance, paying a higher rate for early delivery to reward velocity. Or you could use a fixed price per sprint, where the overall budget is flexible, but each 2-week iteration is dynamically locked as a micro fixed price package for really predictable cost control.
Section 4. Industry R&D and procurement beyond software. So far, we've talked a lot about software, but these agile principles are actively making waves in high-stakes physical industries too. Take surgical instrument R&D. Historically, teams waited months for physical manufacturing. Now, they use rapid 3D printed mockups every 2 weeks. Surgeons test the grips early, give immediate feedback, and the team iterates before any expensive metal is cut. It totally avoids late retooling costs. This is agile hardware in action. And believe it or not, even the notoriously strict public sector is adapting. Government agencies are using resources like the TechFAR Handbook to execute agile delivery within rigid procurement laws. They're using modern mechanisms like bidding against a statement of objectives, focusing on goals and needs, rather than just checking off an outdated, rigid statement of work.
Section 5, Mastering Exam Situations, PMP Preparation.
For those of you gearing up for the 2026 PMP exam, or just looking to sharpen your real-world situational judgment, let's tackle how to apply these mechanics under pressure. Imagine you're on a hybrid project with a rigid, fixed-price SOW. Suddenly, user testing reveals a critical change is needed for route optimization. The vendor points straight to the contract and demands a costly change order. As the PM, what is your best response here?
The absolute best response is trading lower priority backlog items of equal effort. This is exactly what we just talked about. A direct, practical application of the changes for free method. You exchange unstarted work of equivalent size, keeping the budget and timelines perfectly static. Vendor margins are protected, admin bloat is avoided, and the client still gets their critical new feature. As you navigate these scenarios, watch out for 2026 PMP exam trends and common cognitive traps. A massive one is the contract is sacred fallacy, rejecting a perfectly valid customer request just because it deviates from initial SOW boundaries. Another trap? Overusing the Agile CCB. If the product owner already has sole backlog authority, do not submit formal change requests to a CCB. That completely defeats the purpose of Agile. Ultimately, you need a strategic negotiation framework, and your mindset anchor has to be value over compliance. Lean and Agile principles demand that we eliminate waste. You should absolutely not execute low-value sprints or build useless features just because they were in a contract written a year ago. Which leads perfectly into this rule: reject reactive escalations. Before saying no or pointing at legal clauses, PMs must first look for the zone of possible agreement, or ZOPA. We have to facilitate collaborative problem-solving at the team level, mapping out trade-offs way before we ever involve sponsors or legal departments. So I'll leave you with this final thought. In your very next negotiation, will you hide behind a defensive contract, or will you collaborate to deliver true value? The choice completely defines your success. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Be sure to apply these collaborative frameworks in your next interaction. Elevate your projects and keep mastering your infinite business dynamics. See you next time.
Imagine signing a binding multi-million-dollar agreement for a product that neither side actually knows how to build yet. In the 1990s, the standard approach to large-scale projects was built on a massive vulnerability known as information asymmetry. Organizations would spend months drafting exhaustive requirement documents, locking in their most consequential decisions right at the start of the timeline, when their actual knowledge of the final product was at its absolute lowest. This created a deeply adversarial dynamic between buyers and sellers. Because vendors were tied to fixed-price, fixed-scope contracts, any request from the client to adjust the plan was viewed as a direct attack on the vendor's profit margins. Instead of collaborating to build something useful, teams retreated into defensive postures. Updating a single feature meant navigating endless bureaucratic battles with change control boards, mountains of paperwork, and constant finger-pointing over who pays the cost. The tragic result was a system that succeeded on paper but failed in reality. A vendor could deliver every single line item perfectly, according to the legal contract, yet completely fail to solve the customer's actual business problem. Treating a project contract as an unbending law creates a zero-sum game where one side has to lose. And in a fast-moving market, operating that way practically guarantees the entire project will fail. In 2001, a group of software developers recognized this trap and proposed a radical course correction in the Agile Manifesto. They prioritized a new value: customer collaboration over contract negotiation. There is a common misconception that adopting an agile mindset means ditching all documentation and running a lawless project. That is entirely false. Contracts are still highly necessary to protect both parties, but their underlying architecture is completely inverted. To separate legal compliance from day-to-day flexibility, modern organizations use a multi-tier contract. The top tier is the Master Services Agreement. It locks in stable constraints like labor rates and liability. The bottom tier contains agile statements of work, short-term, modular blocks of deliverables that teams pivot based on user feedback without disrupting the legal framework above. By structurally divorcing legal stability from scope delivery, organizations adapt to real-time market shifts without triggering a massive, project-halting legal renegotiation. This structure introduces a powerful operational rule known as scope trading, or changes for free. It allows teams to incorporate mid-project innovations without asking for a dime of new funding. The math is strict. To introduce a new, high-value feature, the customer must extract an unstarted feature of the exact same effort from the backlog. Because of this one-to-one exchange, business utility rises, while the baseline schedule and budget remain completely flat. But what happens if the team finishes the most important work early? That is where the money-for-nothing clause comes into play, serving as the ultimate collaborative mechanism for early project termination. Imagine a 10-sprint project. By sprint 6, the vendor delivers the highest priority value. The customer cancels the remaining 4 sprints of low-priority work, paying a 20% early termination fee. The buyer saves massive capital, and the vendor earns resource-free profit. These engineered contracting clauses force the financial incentives of both the buyer and the seller to align perfectly. They both win by delivering maximum utility with minimum waste. Unlike the inflexible models of the 1990s, the modern framework accepts that you cannot logically lock down every variable up front. Today, the schedule and the cost are treated as the fixed constraints, while the scope itself remains highly fluid. This inversion eliminates the old habit of pushing all the risk onto one side of the table. It replaces an adversarial standoff with a balanced, shared risk operational model. In this environment, the customer is actually a broad coalition, including the internal sponsors, the everyday end users, and even compliance officers, who all have to be continuously engaged in the feedback loop to make sure the right product is being built. The modern project manager acts as a servant leader to make that happen. Instead of rigidly enforcing an outdated statement of work, they facilitate trade-offs and guide the team toward the best possible outcome. The ultimate rule of collaborative project delivery is simple. Delivering a functional, highly usable business outcome will always override strict compliance to an initial, uninformed baseline. A contract should never be a weapon. It should serve as a baseline of trust, empowering teams to transform complex business relationships from defensive battles into high-trust partnerships. If you found these negotiation strategies helpful, make sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. I'm signing off for Infinite Business Dynamics. We'll see you in the next one. Imagine you are 2 years into a massive fixed-price software project. You've spent millions of dollars, but the market has shifted, and the product you are building is now entirely obsolete. Yet, because of the agreement you signed, you were legally compelled to keep paying to finish it. Back in the late 1990s, this was a routine nightmare in software procurement. Exhaustive statements of work, spanning hundreds of pages, were demanded and signed before a single line of code was ever written. This rigid approach was borrowed directly from physical engineering and construction. The logic made sense on a job site. You certainly can't build half a bridge. But this slide outlining systemic waterfall failures reveals the core flaw in applying that logic to software. Forcing clients to lock in specific technical requirements at the start creates a massive information asymmetry. You are making permanent decisions at the exact moment you have the least possible knowledge about a project's feasibility. Notice the downstream effects detailed here. This zero-sum game creates adversarial contracts. Development teams hide behind legal clauses to avoid rework, and simple change requests turn into hostile bureaucratic battlegrounds. Applying rigid predictability to an inherently unpredictable system doesn't create safety. It creates a trap, weaponizing the contract against both the buyer and the seller. In 2001, the Agile Manifesto introduced a specific value to solve this: customer collaboration over contract negotiation. This is often misread as a call to abandon contracts entirely. That is completely false. The real shift is recognizing that a contract must act as a baseline of trust and an enabler of work, rather than a restrictive legal straitjacket. The core mechanic making this possible is the multi-tier contract. You pour a heavy, stable foundation, a master services agreement, to lock in standard legal terms. Above that, you use lightweight, interchangeable modules representing iterative statements of work. This guide on public sector agile procurement shows how even highly regulated U.S. federal agencies use modern mechanisms like modular task orders to cover short-term sprint blocks, allowing the scope to evolve legally over time. By structurally dividing the rigid legal protections from the dynamic feature deliverables, organizations can pivot as often as necessary without sacrificing an ounce of financial governance. To balance risk, we apply Jeff Sutherland's formulas. Changes for free lets clients swap unstarted features for new requirements of equal size, keeping timelines static. Money for nothing allows early cancellation with a 20% exit fee, saving 80% while vendors secure profit. On this chart, a banking app team drops planned features to prioritize biometric login based on user testing. This extends beyond code. In physical R&D, surgical teams use 2-week cycles to 3D print mock-ups. Surgeons test grips immediately, avoiding massive late-stage retooling costs. These formulas perfectly align incentives. The client is saved from paying for obsolete deliverables, while the vendor's profit margins are mathematically protected. This matrix comparing traditional and agile approaches tracks the shift away from one-sided risk and strict conformance toward balanced risk allocation and continuous validation of actual utility. For project managers, this creates a clear behavioral mandate. When conflict arises, it is crucial to reject reactive escalations. When a customer requests a major change, your job is not to enforce the original specs to win a legal argument. Your job is to facilitate a meeting on scope flexibility. You are a bridge, not a bouncer. To master these exact execution strategies, hit subscribe to Infinite Business Dynamics and click the link in the description to access our complete resource library on agile contracting frameworks. In a rapidly evolving market, mastering customer collaboration is an essential structural advantage over mere legal compliance.